The wind howled through the pines as Marcus and David stumbled through the darkness, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the driving rain. The storm had come from nowhere, turning their weekend hike into a fight for survival. When the old cabin appeared through the trees like a mirage, both brothers felt overwhelming relief. The door was unlocked, creaking open to reveal a warm interior that felt like salvation. But as they stepped inside, shaking off the cold, something felt wrong. The fire was still burning. 2 plates sat on the wooden table, steam rising from what looked like a freshly cooked meal. And then Marcus saw it, the photograph on the mantel. 2 young men who looked exactly like them, standing in front of this very cabin. The date on the back read 1952. How could this be possible when they weren't even born until the 1990s? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus set the photograph down with trembling fingers, his engineer's mind struggling to process what his eyes had shown him. The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was impossible. Every line of their faces, the way David's left shoulder sat slightly higher than his right, even the small scar above Marcus's eyebrow from a childhood fall. These men in the photograph weren't just similar to them. They were them. "David, look at this," Marcus called. But his younger brother had already wandered deeper into the cabin, his photographer's eye cataloging details that seemed increasingly out of place. The cabin's interior defied logic. While the exterior appeared weathered and aged, suggesting decades of mountain winters, the inside felt almost modern. The wood floors gleamed with a fresh polish, and the stone fireplace radiated warmth from logs that couldn't have been burning for more than an hour. Yet the storm outside raged with the fury of something that had been building for days. David emerged from what appeared to be a small kitchen, shaking water from his dark hair. "Marcus, there's hot coffee in there. Fresh coffee." The pot's still warm. His voice carried that tone of barely contained excitement that Marcus remembered from their childhood adventures, when David would discover some fascinating insect or unusual rock formation. At 32, David retained the curiosity that had driven him to become a nature photographer, always seeking the story behind the image. His weathered hiking boots and well-worn camera bag spoke of countless expeditions into places most people would never venture. Marcus, 5 years older and more cautious by nature, had chosen engineering precisely because he preferred problems with logical solutions. "This doesn't make sense," Marcus muttered, running his hand along the smooth surface of a wooden table that looked handcrafted but showed no signs of wear. "The windows are intact. The roof isn't leaking despite this storm, and everything inside looks maintained. But there's no road access up here. We hiked for 6 hours through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat." David was already examining a bookshelf, filled with volumes that ranged from local geology texts to what appeared to be hand-bound journals. He pulled one down, a thick, leather-bound book with brass corners that had developed a green patina with age. The cover bore no title, only an embossed symbol that looked like a compass rose intertwined with mountain peaks. "Guest registry," David announced, opening the book with the reverence he typically reserved for rare first editions. The pages were thick parchment filled with entries in various handwritings dating back decades. Names, dates, and brief comments from visitors who had apparently stayed in this very cabin. Marcus leaned over his brother's shoulder as David flipped through the entries. The handwriting styles changed dramatically over the years, some in fountain pen, others in pencil or ballpoint, reflecting the evolution of writing instruments across time. But what caught Marcus's attention wasn't the variety of writing tools, it was the consistency of the comments. "Found shelter from the storm," read one entry from 1987, "Strange dreams but grateful for warmth," noted another from 1961. Entry after entry spoke of unexpected refuge, of storms that seemed to come from nowhere, of gratitude mixed with unease. David's fingers froze as he reached the final page with writing. 2 names were written in careful script, Marcus Thornfield and David Thornfield. The date was today's date. The handwriting was unmistakably their own. "I didn't write this," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither did I." David's usual enthusiasm had been replaced by something closer to reverence. "But look at this." Below their names, in the same handwriting that matched their own, was a single line. "Welcome home." The wind outside intensified, rattling the windows in their frames. The fire in the hearth flickered but didn't diminish, as if the flames themselves were determined to maintain their vigil. Marcus found himself studying the room with new eyes, noting details that spoke of long habitation rather than seasonal use. A hand-knitted throw draped over the back of a rocking chair, its pattern complex and obviously the work of skilled hands. Fresh candles in brass holders, their wicks never lit, but somehow still releasing the faint scent of beeswax. A chess set on a side table, the pieces carved from what looked like local stone, each one bearing tiny initials too small to read from where he stood. "We need to figure out how to get word to Mom," Marcus said. Though even as he spoke, he realized they hadn't seen any power lines during their hike. No telephone poles, no cell towers. His phone had lost signal hours before they'd found the cabin. David was still absorbed in the guest registry, turning pages with increasing fascination. "Marcus, some of these entries, they're describing the same storm. The exact same storm. People writing about the same weather pattern across different decades. Outside, lightning illuminated the windows, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the mountain. But inside the cabin, they remained warm, dry, and inexplicably safe." David closed the guest registry with deliberate care, as if the book itself might hold answers they weren't yet ready to receive. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but within the cabin's walls, an almost supernatural calm prevailed. Marcus had moved to examine the chess set more closely. Drawn by something he couldn't quite articulate, the pieces were exquisite, carved from alternating dark and light stone that seemed to capture and reflect the firelight. Each figure bore the weight of skilled craftsmanship, with details so fine they suggested hours of patient work. But it was the tiny initials carved into the base of each piece that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. MT was etched into the light pieces, DT into the dark ones. "Marcus Thornfield. David Thornfield. David, come look at this." Marcus's voice carried a weight that made his brother abandon the bookshelf immediately. As David approached, Marcus was already reaching for one of the knights, a piece carved with such precision that the horse's mane seemed to flow in an invisible wind. The craftsmanship reminded him of their grandfather's woodworking, the same attention to detail that had filled their childhood home with handmade furniture and toys. "Remember when Dad used to say we'd make great explorers?" David asked quietly, settling into the chair opposite Marcus. "He'd tell us stories about the mountains, about places where time moved differently and ordinary rules didn't apply." Marcus nodded, his fingers tracing the carved initials. Their father, Thomas Thornfield, had been a man of few words but infinite stories. A geologist by training, he'd spent most of their childhood studying mineral formations in remote locations, always returning with tales that seemed too fantastic to be real. Stories of caves that sang in harmonies no human throat could produce, of streams that flowed uphill, of clearings where compasses spun wildly without explanation. "He disappeared when I was 17, Marcus said, though the words felt unnecessary. David had been 12 then, old enough to understand that their father hadn't simply gone on another research expedition. The search teams had found his abandoned campsite, his equipment neatly arranged as if he'd simply stepped away for a moment. But Thomas Thornfield himself had vanished without a trace. "The last time we played chess together was the night before he left," David remembered, reaching across to move a pawn forward. It was an opening move he'd learned from their father, who had taught them that chess was more than a game. It was a conversation between minds, a way of understanding how someone thought and planned. Marcus responded with his own pawn, falling into the familiar rhythm they'd established as children. Their father had insisted they learn to play together, claiming that brothers who could anticipate each other's moves would never truly be lost, no matter how far apart life might take them. He knew something, Marcus said, developing his knight. The way he looked at us that last morning, like he was memorizing our faces. And the things he packed, scientific instruments I'd never seen before. Maps of areas that weren't in any atlas. The chess game continued, both brothers moving with the unconscious precision of decades of practice. Outside, the storm seemed to respond to their conversation, the wind rising and falling as if eavesdropping on their memories. "Mom never talks about it," David observed, castling his king to safety. 20 years, and she still sets a place for him at Christmas dinner. Still keeps his coffee mug in the same spot on the kitchen counter. Their mother, Eleanor, had been a pillar of strength through their father's disappearance and the difficult years that followed. A librarian by profession, she had raised her sons with books and stories, encouraging David's artistic pursuits while supporting Marcus's analytical nature. But she had never remarried, never seemed to consider the possibility that Thomas wouldn't return. She knows something too, Marcus realized, capturing one of David's bishops. The way she reacts whenever we mention hiking in these mountains. She's never forbidden it, but she gets this look. David leaned back in his chair, studying the board with the same intensity he brought to composing a perfect photograph. The game between them had always been evenly matched, each brother's strengths compensating for the other's weaknesses. Marcus's strategic thinking balanced David's intuitive leaps, just as David's willingness to take risks complemented Marcus's careful planning. "What if he's still out here somewhere?" David asked quietly. "What if this place, this cabin, is connected to wherever he went?" The fire crackled in response, sending shadows dancing across the carved chess pieces. The initials on each figure seemed to glow in the flickering light. As if the stone itself held some inner warmth, Marcus moved his queen forward, a bold play that opened up possibilities while creating vulnerabilities. It was exactly the kind of move their father would have appreciated, calculated risk in service of a larger strategy. "Then we find him," Marcus said simply. Outside, the thunder rolled across the mountains like the echo of some distant conversation. And the brothers continued their game, unaware that each move brought them closer to understanding why the chess set bore their initials, and why it felt like coming home. The chess game ended in a stalemate, as their games often did, with both brothers reaching the same conclusion simultaneously. They had learned long ago that their strategic minds worked in harmony rather than opposition, a realization that had shaped their approach to life's larger challenges. As the evening deepened, Marcus explored the cabin's modest sleeping arrangements, while David documented their discovery with his camera, though the digital display seemed to flicker strangely in the cabin's interior. 2 narrow beds occupied a small alcove, separated by a nightstand that held a peculiar brass compass, unlike any navigation instrument Marcus had encountered in his years of backcountry hiking. The compass was substantial, crafted from brass that had developed a rich patina suggesting considerable age. Its face bore traditional cardinal directions, but the needle, instead of pointing steadily north, wavered between northeast and northwest, as if something beyond magnetic north commanded its attention. When Marcus lifted it closer to the lamplight, intricate engravings around the rim became visible, symbols that looked like a fusion of traditional compass roses and topographical markers. "This compass is broken," Marcus announced, though something about the instrument's behavior felt deliberate rather than damaged. David finished photographing the guest registry and joined his brother, accepting the compass with the careful reverence he showed all interesting artifacts. As soon as the brass touched his palm, the needle swung decisively toward the northeast wall of the cabin, pointing through the logs toward something in the mountain darkness. "Maybe it's not broken," David suggested. "Maybe it's pointing toward something other than magnetic north." Marcus took the compass back, watching the needle immediately swing toward the same northeast direction. The behavior was consistent, purposeful. Whatever this instrument was designed to locate, it had found its target. Sleep came eventually, despite the strangeness of their situation. The beds were comfortable, the blankets warm, and the steady rhythm of rain against the windows created a soothing backdrop. But both brothers found themselves caught in dreams that felt more like shared memories than random neural firing. In the dream, they walked through these same mountains in broad daylight, following a path that seemed familiar despite neither having hiked it before. The landscape appeared both as they had seen it during their afternoon climb, and somehow different, older, wilder, with landmarks that didn't match their topographical maps. They encountered other hikers on this dream path, men and women of various ages who nodded in recognition as they passed. Some carried modern equipment, others bore gear that looked decades out of date. All moved with the purposeful stride of people who knew exactly where they were going. At the center of this dream landscape stood a clearing where the compass needle pointed, a place where the mountains seemed to pause and consider itself. Stone formations rose from the earth in patterns too regular to be natural, creating a circle that felt both ancient and somehow expectant. Marcus woke first, the dream's details still vivid in his memory. Dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, revealing that the storm had indeed passed during the night. But something felt different about the quality of that light, as if it were illuminating a world slightly altered from the one they had entered the previous evening. David stirred in the adjacent bed, his photographer's instincts already reaching for his camera before he was fully conscious. "Did you dream about a clearing?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep but urgent with recognition. "Stone circle, other hikers who seem to know us," Marcus confirmed. The compass was pointing toward it. They dressed quickly, both driven by the same inexplicable need to verify what their dreams had shown them. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed by the storm, but carrying an unusual stillness that made every sound seem amplified. Bird calls echoed strangely, and their own footsteps seemed to resonate longer than physics should allow. The compass, when consulted, pointed steadily northeast, just as it had in the cabin. Marcus had spent enough time in the wilderness to trust his navigation skills. But this instrument seemed to operate by rules he didn't understand. "We should head back to the trail," Marcus said, though his words lacked conviction. The logical part of his mind insisted they needed to return to civilization, contact their mother, report their safe emergence from the storm. But a deeper instinct suggested that their journey had only begun. David was already shouldering his pack, the compass secured in his chest pocket where its steady pull could guide their steps. What if the trail leads to whatever this compass wants us to find? Marcus considered the question while studying the mountain landscape that surrounded them. In daylight, their location seemed even more remote than he had realized. No power lines, no distant roads, no signs of human habitation except for the cabin itself. They were deeper in the wilderness than any maintained trail should have taken them. 1 hour, Marcus decided. We follow the compass for 1 hour, then we head back towards civilization. Neither brother believed they would stop after 1 hour. They had walked for less than 30 minutes when David stopped abruptly, his hand pressed against his chest pocket where the compass rested. The needle's pull had grown stronger, more insistent, as if proximity to their destination intensified its magnetic certainty. "Marcus, listen." The mountain had gone silent. No bird calls, no rustle of wind through pine needles, no distant sound of running water. Even their own breathing seemed muted, as if the air itself had thickened around them. In this unnatural quiet, a new sound emerged, faint but unmistakable. Static, radio static, crackling with the irregular rhythm of a transmission struggling through. Interference, following the sound, led them to a rocky outcropping where someone had constructed what appeared to be a makeshift radio station. A vintage ham radio, its metal case worn but functional, sat protected under a natural rock overhang. Cables snaked from the device to an antenna array that had been carefully camouflaged among the surrounding pine branches. The radio was definitely operational. Green lights glowed on its face, and the static emanated from speakers that looked like they belonged in a 1950s electronics shop. But the transmission coming through defied easy explanation. Day 3 in the snow cave. Food running low. If anyone receives this, we're approximately 12 miles northeast of Ironwood Falls. Elevation 7,800 feet. David reached for the microphone, but Marcus caught his wrist. The voice was clear, desperate, unmistakably human. But according to Marcus's altimeter, they were at exactly 7,800 feet elevation. And Ironwood Falls was indeed 12 miles to the southwest. Thompson and Sarah Chen, Berkeley Hiking Club. The storm hit faster than the Weather Service predicted. We have enough supplies for maybe 2 more days. That's impossible, Marcus whispered. The storm just passed. There's no snow, and the weather's been clear for days before yesterday. The transmission continued, detailing a survival situation that didn't match their current reality. But the location description was too accurate to dismiss, and the desperation in the voice was undeniably genuine. David freed his wrist and keyed the microphone. Berkeley Hiking Club, this is David Thornfield. What's your current date? Static filled the airwaves for several heartbeats before the response came. November 15th, 1987. Who is this? Are you with search and rescue? Marcus felt the world tilt slightly around him. That's not possible, he repeated, but his engineer's mind was already trying to process what he was hearing. My name is David Thornfield, David repeated into the microphone. Can you describe your exact location? Any landmarks? There's a stone circle about half a mile northeast of our position. Ancient looking, definitely not natural. We were trying to reach it when the storm hit. My grandfather's compass kept pointing toward it, said it was some kind of family landmark. The brothers exchanged glances. David pulled out their brass compass. It pointed steadily northeast, toward what they assumed was the same stone circle described by a voice from 1987. We're going to try to reach your location, David transmitted. Keep broadcasting every hour on this frequency. Thank God. Look for the stone circle. If you're family, your compass will guide you. Grandfather always said, the transmission cut to static, then silence. Marcus was staring at the radio equipment with growing comprehension. This isn't a coincidence. Someone set up this station specifically to receive these transmissions. Look at the frequency settings. They're marked with dates. David examined the radio more closely. Small pieces of tape beneath various frequency dials bore handwritten dates spanning decades. 1987. 1961, 1952, 1934. Each frequency was carefully labeled, as if someone had spent years cataloging when and where these impossible transmissions occurred. Try another frequency, Marcus suggested. Though part of him dreaded what they might hear, David turned the dial to the frequency marked 1952. Almost immediately, a different voice emerged from the speakers. Name is Thomas Chen, Geological Survey Team. We've been trapped for 6 days. The mountains are doing things that don't appear in any textbook. Time seems unstable here. If anyone receives this transmission, stay away from the stone circle during the astronomical alignments. The voice cut out, replaced by static, then another voice, older but with the same fundamental characteristics. Is Michael Chen. 1923. The family compass brought me here, just like it brought my son and will bring his children. The circle must be protected. Someone must always listen. David's hands were shaking as he reached for the microphone. This is David Thornfield, November 2024. Can anyone hear me? The static cleared momentarily, and when the response came, it was a voice they both recognized, older, weathered by years, but unmistakably familiar. Hello, boys. I've been waiting for you to find the radio. This is your father. The silence that followed their father's voice stretched impossibly long, filled with 20 years of unanswered questions and the weight of a mother's patient waiting. David gripped the microphone so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. while Marcus found himself checking and rechecking the radio's frequency settings, as if proper engineering principles might somehow explain what they were experiencing. "Dad?" David's voice cracked like it had when he was 12 years old. "Where are you? We've been looking for you." Static filled the airwaves, then their father's voice returned, older than they remembered, but unmistakably Thomas Thornfield. "I'm here, son. I've always been here watching over this place. And now it's your turn to understand why." Marcus leaned toward the microphone. "Dad, this doesn't make sense. The radio transmissions from different decades, the compass, the cabin. What's happening to us? You'll find the answers in the emergency cache, boys. Follow the compass northeast until you reach the stone circle. Look for the cairn with the red marker stone on top. Inside, you'll find everything I've documented over the years." The transmission faded, leaving them with coordinates and the steady pull of the brass compass. Neither brother spoke as they packed up their gear and began walking northeast, each lost in the implications of hearing their father's voice after 2 decades of silence. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed, requiring careful navigation around granite outcroppings and dense stands of pine. But the compass never wavered, its needle pointing steadily toward their destination. With mechanical certainty, they found the cairn exactly where their father had described, a carefully constructed pile of stones, topped with a distinctive red granite marker that stood out against the mountain's typical grey stone. The cache itself was concealed beneath a camouflaged panel that required both brothers working together to lift, as if it had been designed specifically for 2 people to access. Inside, they discovered a weatherproof container filled with documents that represented decades of meticulous research. But it was the collection of missing person flyers that stopped both. Brothers cold, face after face, stared up at them from yellowed papers and faded photographs. Hikers who had disappeared in these mountains across 7 decades. The earliest flyer dated from 1952, featuring a young man whose bone structure and facial features could have made him Marcus's twin. The next, from 1961, showed a woman with David's distinctive nose and the same slight asymmetry to her smile. "This isn't possible," Marcus whispered, spreading the flyers across the rocky ground. Every missing person bore an unmistakable family resemblance to one brother or the other. Some could have been their siblings, others their cousins, but all clearly shared the same genetic heritage. David was photographing each flyer with growing fascination and dread. "Look at the patterns, Marcus. They disappear in pairs, always 2 people, always related, always during specific weather events." The documentation was thorough and deeply unsettling. Each disappearance had occurred during unusual atmospheric conditions, sudden storms, unexpected temperature drops, electromagnetic anomalies that disrupted radio communications and navigation equipment. And in every case, the missing persons had been carrying compasses that pointed toward the stone circle. "Your father spent years tracking these patterns," came a new voice from the radio David had left running. It was elderly, female, speaking with the careful precision of someone accustomed to being precise about important matters. "My name is Elena Vasquez, and I've been monitoring these transmissions since 1963, when my own sons disappeared in these mountains." David keyed the microphone. "Mrs. Vasquez, this is David Thornfield. We just found my father's research. The missing people, they all look like us. They are you, child. Or rather, they're what you would have been if you'd been born in different decades. This mountain exists at a convergence point where time moves differently. Families are drawn here across generations, called by something older than our understanding." Marcus was studying a geological survey map his father had annotated with dozens of markings. The mountain's magnetic field is anomalous, he realized. These readings don't make sense according to standard geological principles. The stone circle is the center of it all. Elena's voice continued. "Your father discovered that certain bloodlines are sensitive to the temporal disturbances. The mountain calls to you because it needs guardians, people, who can move between the time streams without being lost in them." David found himself staring at a photograph from 1934, showing two young men standing beside the same stone circle they were approaching. The resemblance to him and Marcus was so perfect it might have been a photograph of them taken in period costume. "What happened to all these people?" David asked into the radio. "Some became guardians, learning to protect the boundary between times. Others were lost in the spaces between moments. And some," Elena paused meaningfully, "chose to return home, but found they could never truly leave this place behind." The radio crackled with interference, then fell silent. Around them, the mountain seemed to hold its breath, waiting for their decision about whether to continue toward the stone circle, or turn back toward a world that suddenly felt much smaller and more fragile than they had ever imagined. Among the documents in their father's cache, Marcus discovered a geological survey map unlike any he had encountered in his professional experience. The paper itself felt substantial, almost cloth-like, bearing the official seal of the U.S. Geological Survey dated 1935, but the notations scattered across its surface defied conventional scientific understanding. Traditional topographical markers indicated elevation, water sources, and rock formations with familiar symbols. However, overlaid in different colored inks were additional markings that suggested phenomena no geology textbook had ever described. Areas were labeled temporal flux zone, electromagnetic anomaly, and most intriguingly, time stream confluence. "David, look at this," Marcus called, spreading the map across a flat boulder. "According to this survey, the entire mountain sits on what they're calling a chronological fault line." David joined him, comparing the map's features to the landscape around them. Their current position was marked as being within something called a temporal stability zone, which explained with disturbing clarity why the radio transmissions from different decades were possible. The map's margins contained handwritten notes in multiple styles of penmanship, as if different researchers had added observations across many years. One notation in their father's distinctive handwriting read, "Mining operations, 1932-1936, exposed mineral formations with unknown properties. Temporal disturbances began immediately following excavation of Site 7. There's a whole section here about the Native American legends," David observed, pointing to a carefully preserved insert paper attached to the main map. The Blackfeet called this mountain where time stands still. They considered it sacred, avoided it during certain celestial alignments. Marcus traced the marked locations of the 1930s mining operations with his finger. The excavation sites formed a rough circle around what the map designated as the primary temporal nexus, exactly where their compass was guiding them. According to the documentation, the mining company had been seeking rare earth minerals, but had instead uncovered something that caused their equipment to malfunction and their workers to report disturbing experiences. "Listen to this," David read from one of the attached reports. "Different of excavation. 3 more workers have reported seeing deceased relatives among the crew. Some pieces malfunction near Site 7. Compass readings inconsistent. Recommend immediate cessation of operations." The mining had stopped abruptly in 1936, but not before the excavation had apparently destabilized whatever natural barriers had kept the mountain's temporal anomalies contained. The map showed the gradual expansion of affected areas over subsequent decades, with the zones of influence growing larger each year. Marcus's engineering mind struggled to process information that contradicted everything he understood about physics and geology. According to these measurements, time moves at different rates in different locations across the mountain. Near the stone circle, 1 hour equals approximately 6 hours in normal time flow, which would explain how our father could have been here for 20 years while maintaining radio contact, David realized. Time dilation. He's been experiencing the passage of time differently than we have. They had been walking northeast for what felt like hours, but according to their watches, only 30 minutes had passed. The compass continued its steady pull, but the landscape around them had begun to shift in subtle ways that suggested they were entering one of the mapped anomaly zones. Trees appeared older the further they traveled, their trunks showing growth rings that would have required centuries to develop. Rock formations displayed erosion patterns that didn't match the surrounding geology, as if they had weathered under different atmospheric conditions. Even the quality of light seemed different, carrying overtones that reminded David of the golden hour that photographers prized, but lasting far longer than natural light cycles should allow. "We should mark our path," Marcus suggested, though he realized with growing unease that their footprints in the soft earth behind them seemed to fade more quickly than they should, as if the mountain itself was erasing evidence of their passage. David was documenting everything with his camera, but the digital display showed timestamps that didn't match their watches. Some photographs registered dates from decades in the past, others from years in the future. The camera, like every other piece of technology they carried, was responding to the mountain's influence in ways that defied logical explanation. The radio crackled back to life as they walked, carrying fragments of conversations from different time periods. Voices discussed weather patterns that didn't match any season they recognized, described celestial events that wouldn't occur for decades, and spoke of family members who lived in eras separated by generations. "The cabin we stayed in last night," Marcus realized, studying the map's detailed annotations. "It's not just a shelter. According to this, it's positioned at the exact center of a temporal stability matrix. It exists simultaneously in multiple time streams, which means we didn't just find random shelter from a storm," David concluded. "We were guided there. The mountain wanted us to find it." The compass needle began to vibrate with increasing intensity, suggesting they were approaching their destination. Around them, the afternoon light held that same golden quality, but the shadows were beginning to move in ways that had nothing to do with the sun's position in the sky. As they crested a ridge that hadn't appeared on any of their modern topographical maps, David spotted something that made him stop so abruptly that Marcus nearly collided with him. Partially concealed beneath a natural rock overhang was what appeared to be a more permanent shelter, not the rough construction of a temporary camp, but careful stonework that suggested someone had lived here for an extended period. The structure blended so seamlessly with the mountainside that they might have walked past it entirely, if not for the thin wisp of smoke rising from what was clearly a functional chimney. Someone was home. Marcus approached the shelter with the caution of an engineer assessing structural integrity, while David's photographer's eye catalogued details that spoke of long habitation and careful craft. The stonework was masterful, fitted together without mortar in a technique that would have impressed ancient builders. Windows had been cut with precision and fitted with glass that somehow remained unbroken, despite obvious exposure to decades of mountain weather. "Hello?" Marcus called out, though something about the place made him want to whisper. The response came from inside the shelter, muffled but unmistakably familiar. "Come in, boys. I've been expecting you." The interior was larger than the external structure suggested, extending back into the mountain itself, through what appeared to be a natural cave system that had been carefully modified for human habitation. But it was the man sitting beside the fire that made both brothers forget their surroundings entirely. Thomas Thornfield looked exactly as they remembered him from 20 years ago, perhaps slightly weathered by mountain living, but not aged in the way that 2 decades should have marked him. His hair held the same dark brown color, his hands showed the same strength, and when he smiled, it was with the same quiet warmth that had characterized their childhood memories. "Dad?" David's voice carried the uncertain tone of someone afraid to trust what his eyes were showing him. "Hello, son. Marcus." Thomas stood with fluid grace, moving toward them with arms open for embraces that both brothers fell into without hesitation. He felt solid, real, warm with the life they had mourned for 20 years, but how Marcus began, then stopped, realizing that conventional questions about aging and time might not apply in this place. Thomas gestured toward handmade chairs arranged around the fire. "Sit down. There's a lot I need to explain, and not much time before you'll need to make your choice." On a wooden table beside Thomas's chair lay a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with entries written in the same careful handwriting that had marked their father's geological notes throughout their childhood. The journal was substantial, clearly representing years of observation and documentation. "I've been here for what feels like 6 months," Thomas began, opening the journal to pages covered with detailed sketches and precise notations. "But in the outside world, 20 years have passed. Time moves differently here, boys. The closer you get to the stone circle, the more slowly it passes relative to normal reality." David leaned forward to examine the journal's contents. The pages contained detailed maps of areas they had never seen, sketches of people in clothing from different historical periods, and notes about phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. "I came here following geological anomalies," Thomas continued, turning pages to show readings from instruments they didn't recognize. "But I stayed because I discovered what this place really is. A guardian post. Someone needs to monitor the temporal boundaries, to prevent the kind of catastrophic intersection that could tear apart the fabric of time itself." Marcus studied a page covered with mathematical calculations that hurt his head to contemplate. "You're saying you chose to stay here? That you abandoned us deliberately?" The pain in Thomas's eyes was immediate and profound. "I made the hardest choice any father could make. I stayed to protect you, to protect everyone. Every 70 years, this mountain experiences what the old surveys called a temporal convergence. Reality becomes unstable, and without someone here to maintain the barriers, past and future could collapse into each other." The journal contained sketches of the stone circle from different time periods, showing how its appearance had changed across decades. Sometimes it was surrounded by primitive structures, sometimes by mining equipment, sometimes by people in clothing from eras spanning centuries. "But why us?" David asked. "Why our family?" Thomas turned to a page filled with genealogical charts that traced their bloodline back through generations. "We're sensitive to the temporal disturbances because our ancestors were among the original guardians. The Native Americans, who first discovered this place, chose certain families to watch over it. We've been bound to this responsibility for over 200 years. The journal showed entries from previous generations, great-grandfathers and great-great-uncles who had made the same choice Thomas faced, who had stayed to guard the boundaries between time streams while their families believed them dead or missing. "The next convergence is beginning," Thomas said quietly. "I can feel it in the mountain's heartbeat, and I'm getting too old to maintain the barriers alone. The responsibility needs to pass to the next generation." Marcus felt the weight of implication settling around them like a physical presence. "You're asking us to abandon our lives, our mother, our careers, everything we've built. I'm asking you to consider whether protecting all of reality might be worth that sacrifice." Marcus traced the marked locations of the 1930s mining operations with his finger. The excavation sites formed a rough circle around what the map designated as the primary temporal nexus, exactly where their compass was guiding them. According to the documentation, the mining company had been seeking rare earth minerals, but had instead uncovered something that caused their equipment to malfunction and their workers to report disturbing experiences. "Listen to this." David read from one of the attached reports. "Day 47 of excavation. 3 more workers have reported seeing deceased relatives among the crew. Timepieces malfunction near Site 7. Compass readings inconsistent. Recommend immediate cessation of operations." The mining had stopped abruptly in 1936, but not before the excavation had apparently destabilized whatever natural barriers had kept the mountain's temporal anomalies contained. The map showed the gradual expansion of affected areas over subsequent decades, with the zones of influence growing larger each year. Marcus's engineering mind struggled to process information that contradicted everything he understood about physics and geology. According to these measurements, time moves at different rates in different locations across the mountain. Near the stone circle, 1 hour equals approximately 6 hours in normal time flow, which would explain how our father could have been here for 20 years while maintaining radio contact, David realized. Time dilation. He's been experiencing the passage of time differently than we have. They had been walking northeast for what felt like hours, but according to their watches, only 30 minutes had passed. The compass continued its steady pull, but the landscape around them had begun to shift in subtle ways that suggested they were entering one of the mapped anomaly zones. Trees appeared older the further they traveled, their trunks showing growth rings that would have required centuries to develop. Rock formations displayed erosion patterns that didn't match the surrounding geology, as if they had weathered under different atmospheric conditions. Even the quality of light seemed different, carrying overtones that reminded David of the golden hour that photographers prized. But lasting far longer than natural light cycles should allow, we should mark our path, Marcus suggested, though he realized with growing unease that their footprints in the soft earth behind them seemed to fade more quickly than they should, as if the mountain itself was erasing evidence of their passage. David was documenting everything with his camera, but the digital display showed timestamps that didn't match their watches. Some photographs registered dates from decades in the past, others from years in the future. The camera, like every other piece of technology they carried, was responding to the mountain's influence in ways that defied logical explanation. The radio crackled back to life as they walked, carrying fragments of conversations from different time periods. Voices discussed weather patterns that didn't match any season they recognized, described celestial events that wouldn't occur for decades, and spoke of family members who lived in eras separated by generations. The cabin we stayed in last night, Marcus realized, studying the map's detailed annotations. It's not just a shelter. According to this, it's positioned at the exact center of a temporal stability matrix. It exists simultaneously in multiple time streams, which means we didn't just find random shelter from a storm, David concluded. We were guided there. The mountain wanted us to find it. The compass needle began to vibrate with increasing intensity, suggesting they were approaching their destination. Around them, the afternoon light held that same golden quality, but the shadows were beginning to move in ways that had nothing to do with the sun's position in the sky. As they crested a ridge that hadn't appeared on any of their modern topographical maps, David spotted something that made him stop so abruptly that Marcus nearly collided with him. Partially concealed beneath a natural rock overhang was what appeared to be a more permanent shelter, not the rough construction of a temporary camp, but careful stonework that suggested someone had lived here for an extended period. The structure blended so seamlessly with the mountainside that they might have walked past it entirely if not for the thin wisp of smoke rising from what was clearly a functional chimney. Someone was home. Marcus approached the shelter with the caution of an engineer assessing structural integrity, while David's photographer's eye catalogued details that spoke of long habitation and careful craft. The stonework was masterful, fitted together without mortar in a technique that would have impressed ancient builders. Windows had been cut with precision and fitted with glass that somehow remained unbroken despite obvious exposure to decades of mountain weather. "Hello?" Marcus called out. Though something about the place made him want to whisper, the response came from inside the shelter, muffled but unmistakably familiar. "Come in, boys. I've been expecting you." The interior was larger than the external structure suggested, extending back into the mountain itself through what appeared to be a natural cave system that had been carefully modified for human habitation. But it was the man sitting beside the fire that made both brothers forget their surroundings entirely. Thomas Thornfield looked exactly as they remembered him from 20 years ago, perhaps slightly weathered by mountain living. but not aged in the way that 2 decades should have marked him. His hair held the same dark brown color, his hands showed the same strength, and when he smiled it was with the same quiet warmth that had characterized their childhood memories. "Dad?" David's voice carried the uncertain tone of someone afraid to trust what his eyes were showing him. "Hello." "Son, Marcus." Thomas stood with fluid grace, moving toward them with arms open for embraces that both brothers fell into without hesitation. He felt solid, real, warm with the life they had mourned for 20 years. "But how?" Marcus began, then stopped, realizing that conventional questions about aging and time might not apply in this place. Thomas gestured toward handmade chairs arranged around the fire. "Sit down. There's a lot I need to explain, and not much time before you'll need to make your choice." On a wooden table beside Thomas's chair lay a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with entries written in the same careful handwriting that had marked their father's geological notes throughout their childhood. The journal was substantial, clearly representing years of observation and documentation. "I've been here for what feels like 6 months, Thomas began, opening the journal to pages covered with detailed sketches and precise notations. "But in the outside world, 20 years have passed. Time moves differently here, boys. The closer you get to the stone circle, the more slowly it passes relative to normal reality." David leaned forward to examine the journal's contents. The pages contained detailed maps of areas they had never seen, sketches of people in clothing from different historical periods, and notes about phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. "I came here following geological anomalies," Thomas continued, turning pages to show readings from instruments they didn't recognize. "But I stayed because I discovered what this place really is, a guardian post. Someone needs to monitor the temporal boundaries, to prevent the kind of catastrophic intersection that could tear apart the fabric of time itself." Marcus studied a page covered with mathematical calculations that hurt his head to contemplate. "You're saying you chose to stay here? That you abandoned us deliberately?" The pain in Thomas's eyes was immediate and profound. "I made the hardest choice any father could make. I stayed to protect you, to protect everyone. Every 70 years, this mountain experiences what the old surveys called a temporal convergence. Reality becomes unstable, and without someone here to maintain the barriers, past and future could collapse into each other." The journal contained sketches of the stone circle from different time periods, showing how its appearance had changed across decades. Sometimes it was surrounded by primitive structures, sometimes by mining equipment, sometimes by people in clothing from eras spanning centuries. "But why us?" David asked. "Why our family?" Thomas turned to a page filled with genealogical charts that traced their bloodline back through generations. "We're sensitive to the temporal disturbances because our ancestors were among the original guardians. The Native Americans who first discovered this place chose certain families to watch over it. We've been bound to this responsibility for over 200 years. The journal showed entries from previous generations, great-grandfathers and great-great-uncles who had made the same choice Thomas faced, who had stayed to guard the boundaries between time streams while their families believed them dead or missing. "The next convergence is beginning," Thomas said quietly. "I can feel it in the mountain's heartbeat, and I'm getting too old to maintain the barriers alone. The responsibility needs to pass to the next generation." Marcus felt the weight of implications settling around them like a physical presence. "You're asking us to abandon our lives, our mother, our careers, everything we've built. I'm asking you to consider whether protecting all of reality might be worth that sacrifice." Thomas led them deeper into his mountain home, through passages that had been carved from living rock with a precision that spoke of decades of patient work. The walls were lined with shelves containing artifacts from different eras, tools, clothing, personal items that seemed to span centuries of human presence on the mountain. "Every guardian leaves something behind," Thomas explained, noting their fascination with the collection. "A record of their time here, evidence of their sacrifice. And sometimes, he paused beside a particular shelf, they leave behind mysteries that take years to solve. He reached for what appeared to be a vintage camera, its leather case worn smooth by handling, but the brass fittings still gleaming with care. The camera was a medium format model that David recognized as being from the 1960s, though this particular example showed modifications that hadn't been part of the original design. "Found this in the stone circle 3 years ago," Thomas said, handing the camera to David. It was sitting on the central altar stone, as if someone had just set it down moments before. "But the interesting thing is what's inside." David opened the camera with the reverence of someone who understood fine photographic equipment. Inside, a roll of film remained partially exposed, as if the photographer had been interrupted mid-session. The advanced mechanism showed that roughly half the roll had been used. "The film is still good?" David asked, though he was already mentally calculating the chemistry needed to develop decades-old film stock. "I built a darkroom back there." Thomas gestured toward another passage. "Took me 2 years to get the chemistry right for film that's been exposed to the mountain's temporal fields. The results are educational." The darkroom was a marvel of improvised engineering, carved from a natural cave and equipped with developing trays made from stones that had been ground smooth and sealed with pine resin. The enlarger was clearly handmade, but constructed with the precision of someone who understood optics and had unlimited time to perfect the work. David developed the film with meticulous care, using techniques his father had clearly refined through extensive experimentation. As images emerged in the developer solution, both brothers found themselves staring at photographs that documented the impossible. The first frame showed the stone circle as they had seen it in their dreams, but populated with people from different historical periods standing together as if at some kind of gathering. A woman in 1940s clothing spoke earnestly with a man wearing what appeared to be medieval garments, while children in modern hiking gear played among stones that looked far older than any human civilization. Subsequent frames revealed more scenes of temporal intersection, people from different eras working together on projects that defied easy categorization. They appeared to be maintaining the stone circle, making careful adjustments to its arrangement while consulting instruments that ranged from ancient astronomical devices to modern scientific equipment. "These people," Marcus said, studying a frame that showed someone who looked remarkably like their grandmother, "they're all from our family line." "Some of them," Thomas confirmed, "but others are from the bloodlines of different guardian families. We're not the only ones bound to this place, just the ones responsible for this particular convergence point." David continued developing images, each frame revealing new aspects of the mountain's hidden community. There were workshops where people crafted tools from materials that didn't appear in any geology textbook, laboratories where ancient wisdom merged with modern scientific method, and gathering places where representatives from different centuries shared knowledge across the barriers of time. One photograph stopped. David Cold, a group portrait showing multiple generations of what was clearly their own family line, standing together despite having lived in different decades. His grandfather was there, looking exactly as David remembered him from childhood, standing beside great-uncles who had supposedly died in various wars and accidents across the 20th century. "They're not dead," David realized. "Our whole family history, all the men who supposedly died young or disappeared, they came here." "The mountain calls to specific bloodlines during times of crisis," Thomas explained. "But it also offers sanctuary to those who choose to accept the responsibility. Every man in our family line for the past 2 centuries has eventually found his way here." Marcus was studying the technical aspects of a photograph showing the stone circle during what appeared to be some kind of astronomical event. The stones themselves seemed to be glowing with an inner light, and the air around them shimmered with distortions that suggested the fabric of reality was being actively manipulated. "This is why you could never come home," Marcus said quietly. "It wasn't just about protecting the timeline. Once you've seen this, once you know what's really happening, how could you go back to pretending the normal world is all there is?" Thomas nodded, his expression carrying the weight of 20 years of isolation from the family he loved. "The hardest part isn't the responsibility, boys. It's knowing that everyone you care about is living in a smaller, more fragile reality than they understand, and being powerless to share that knowledge without destroying their peace." David carefully hung the final print to dry, completing a visual record of the mountain's hidden society. The photographs revealed a community that spanned centuries, united by duty and sacrifice, working together to maintain barriers between time streams that most people would never know existed. "How many of us are there?" David asked. "More than you might think," Thomas smiled. "And after tonight, hopefully 2 more." As evening approached, Thomas led them to what he called his observation post, a carefully constructed platform that extended from the mountainside, offering an unobstructed view of the stone circle below. The structure was an engineering marvel, built into the rock face with supports that seemed to grow from the mountain itself rather than being imposed upon. But it was the instrument mounted at the platform's center that captured Marcus's attention immediately. At first glance, it resembled a weather station. Wind gauges, barometric pressure sensors, temperature monitors arranged in a precise array. However, closer examination revealed modifications that no meteorological equipment should require. Additional sensors measured electromagnetic fluctuations, gravitational variations, and something the carefully handwritten labels identified as temporal pressure differentials. The readouts displayed measurements that challenged everything Marcus understood about atmospheric science, showing values that fluctuated not with weather patterns, but with something far more fundamental. "I spent 3 years building this," Thomas said, adjusting one of the sensors with the practiced ease of long familiarity. "Traditional weather instruments can't measure what really affects this mountain. This monitors the health of the barriers between time streams." David was photographing the instrument array, fascinated by the integration of conventional scientific equipment with devices he couldn't identify. Some components appeared to be carved from the same stone as the circle below, their surfaces etched with symbols that predated any known writing system. "The readings have been changing," Thomas continued, pointing to a graph that tracked measurements over several months. "Whatever stability we've maintained for the past 20 years is beginning to break down. The next convergence will be stronger than anything in recorded history." Marcus studied the data with growing comprehension and concern. The patterns showed increasing instability in what Thomas labeled chronological integrity, periods where past and future began, bleeding through into the present with dangerous frequency. "Look at this spike from 3 days ago," Marcus observed, pointing to a dramatic surge in all measurements. "This corresponds exactly with when David and I started our hike. Your arrival triggered something," Thomas agreed. "The mountain recognized you, began preparing for the transition of responsibility. But it also attracted attention from forces that prefer the barriers to remain unstable. As if summoned by his words, the instrument readings began fluctuating wildly. Temperature sensors showed impossible variations, swinging between summer warmth and winter cold within seconds. The electromagnetic readings spiked beyond the instrument's capacity to measure, and something Thomas called the temporal cohesion index dropped precipitously toward what was clearly marked as a danger zone. Below them, the stone circle began to glow with the same inner light David had seen in the photographs. But instead of the controlled luminescence those images had shown, this light pulsed erratically, creating shadows that moved independently of their sources. "It's beginning," Thomas said, his voice carrying 20 years of preparation and dread. "David, Marcus, you need to see what happens when the barriers weaken." Around the stone circle, the air itself began to shimmer and distort. Through these distortions, other landscapes became visible. The same mountainside, but in different seasons, different decades, different configurations entirely. They could see the mining operations from the 1930s superimposed over the present moment, with workers in period clothing moving among machinery that existed decades in the past. Simultaneously, future visions leaked through. The mountain covered with structures they didn't recognize, populated by people wearing clothing that suggested technological advances far beyond their current era. Most disturbing were the glimpses of devastated landscapes, versions of their mountain where the temporal barriers had failed completely and reality had collapsed into chaos. Without active management, the convergence points become unstable, Thomas explained. Making rapid adjustments to his instruments, past, present, and future begin to exist simultaneously in the same space. The results are catastrophic for everyone caught in the overlap zones. Marcus was taking readings from his own instruments, comparing them to Thomas's more sophisticated equipment. The gravitational variations alone would be deadly. And if time is moving at different rates in different locations, people get lost between moments, Thomas finished. Trapped in temporal loops, aging decades in minutes, or frozen in single instants for eternity. I've seen it happen. David lowered his camera, understanding finally dawning. This is why you stayed, not just to monitor, but to actively prevent these overlaps. Every day for 20 years, Thomas confirmed. Making micro-adjustments to the stone circle's configuration, maintaining the resonance frequencies that keep the barriers stable, preventing the kind of catastrophic intersection we're witnessing right now. The instrument readings continued their alarming fluctuations while below them, multiple versions of reality struggled for dominance. The brothers could see themselves in some of the temporal bleeds, versions where they had made different choices, lived different lives, aged into different men. How do you stop it? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. You don't stop it, Thomas replied. You become part of it. You learn to move between the time streams, to guide them instead of being trapped by them. You become a guardian not just of this place, but of the fundamental nature of reality itself. The meteorological instrument screamed warnings as temporal pressure reached critical levels, and around them, the mountain prepared to reveal the true scope of the choice the brothers would need to make. As the temporal distortions intensified around the stone circle, Thomas reached into his shirt and withdrew something the brothers hadn't seen since their childhood, a signet ring that had belonged to their grandfather. The gold band was worn smooth by generations of handling, but the family crest remained clearly defined, a mountain peak surrounded by a compass rose, with symbols etched around the border that now seemed far more significant than decorative flourishes. Grandfather wore this every day of his life, Thomas said, holding the ring toward the flickering light emanating from the stone circle below. I thought it was just family tradition until I came here and understood what the symbols really mean. David accepted the ring with reverence, feeling its substantial weight. In the strange light of the temporal disturbances, the metal seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth. As his fingers traced the familiar crest, the carved symbols began to glow with the same energy they could see dancing around the stones below. The compass rose marks the convergence points, Thomas explained, pointing to corresponding symbols etched into the stone circle's central altar. Our family has been bound to this particular nexus for 8 generations. The ring chooses the next guardian when the time comes. Marcus watched as the ring's glow intensified in David's hands, the light pulsing in rhythm with the temporal fluctuations their father's instruments were measuring. Choose how? It's just metal and stone. Metal and stone that's been exposed to temporal energy for over 2 centuries, Thomas corrected. The ring doesn't just mark our family's connection to this place. It's been transformed by that connection. It can sense the barriers between time streams, guide its wearer through temporal distortions that would trap or kill anyone else. David slipped the ring onto his finger, and immediately his perception of their surroundings changed dramatically. The overlapping realities below, became distinct and navigable rather than chaotic. He could see pathways through the temporal distortions, safe routes that would allow someone to move between different time streams without being lost in the spaces between moments. "I can see them," David whispered in amazement. "All the different versions of this place, all the different times. And there are people moving through them, other guardians working to keep everything stable." Through the ring's enhanced perception, David observed the hidden community Thomas had described. Men and women from different centuries coordinated their efforts across time streams, each maintaining specific aspects of the temporal barriers. Some worked alone, others in pairs, but all moved with the confidence of people who had learned to navigate impossible realities. "Every guardian family has a focus object," Thomas continued. "Ours is the ring. Others have different tools, crystals, carved stones, instruments passed down through their bloodlines. But they all serve the same purpose. They allow us to function in an environment where normal human consciousness would be overwhelmed." Marcus was studying the ring through his engineer's perspective, trying to understand how metal could interact with temporal forces. "You're describing technology that shouldn't be possible. How does a ring affect the flow of time?" "The same way a compass affects navigation," Thomas replied. "It doesn't change the magnetic field. It helps you understand and work with forces that already exist. The ring doesn't control time, but it allows its wearer to perceive temporal currents and move through them safely." David was experimenting with the ring's capabilities, learning to shift his perception between different time streams. In one, he could see the mountain as it had existed before human contact, populated by the Native American communities who had first discovered its unusual properties. In another, he observed the mining operations that had destabilized the natural barriers. Most disturbing was a future timeline where the convergence points had failed completely, leaving reality fractured beyond repair. The responsibility isn't just about maintaining the barriers, David realized. It's about choosing which future becomes real. Every decision a guardian makes influences which timeline stabilizes as the primary reality, Thomas confirmed. We're not just protecting the present, we're actively shaping what the future will become. The ring grew warmer on David's finger as the temporal disturbances reached a new peak of intensity. Through its enhanced perception, he could see that their arrival had triggered something far more significant than a routine convergence. Multiple timeline fractures were opening simultaneously, creating a crisis that would require unprecedented intervention. "This isn't the normal 70-year cycle," David announced, his voice carrying new authority that seemed to come from the ring itself. "Something else is happening. The barriers aren't just weakening, they're being deliberately attacked." Thomas's expression darkened with understanding. "The Shadow Guardians. I hoped we had more time before they made their move." "Shadow Guardians?" Marcus demanded. "Guardians who chose differently," Thomas explained grimly, "who decided that reality would be better served by allowing the timelines to merge completely. They've been working for decades to destabilize convergence points around the world, and now they're making their final push." The ring pulsed with warning energy, and David could see through the temporal distortions that they were no longer alone on the mountain. Figures moved through the time streams with hostile intent, approaching the stone circle from multiple temporal directions simultaneously. "They're coming," David warned, "and they're bringing weapons that don't exist in any single timeline." Thomas led them quickly back into his mountain shelter, moving with the urgency of someone who had prepared for this moment for 20 years. Deep within the cave system, he brought them to a chamber they hadn't seen before. A natural cavern whose walls had been polished to an almost mirror-like finish, reflecting and amplifying the strange energies emanating from the convergence outside. At the center of this chamber stood what appeared to be a standing mirror, though its surface showed not their reflections, but something far more complex and disturbing. The frame was carved from the same temporal stone as the circle below, and the mirror's surface rippled like water, while displaying images that shifted and changed with hypnotic fluidity. The mirror of consequences, Thomas said, his voice heavy with the weight of difficult knowledge. It shows the potential outcomes of major decisions, the futures that branch from critical choice points. I've spent 20 years consulting it, trying to understand which actions preserve reality and which ones lead to chaos. David approached the mirror cautiously, the family ring pulsing with increased intensity as he drew near. The surface cleared momentarily, showing him and Marcus as they were now, standing in the cavern with expressions of wonder and growing dread. But as he watched, the image began to split and multiply, showing dozens of different versions of this moment. In some reflections, they turned away from the mirror and walked back toward the stone circle, accepting their role as guardians. These timelines showed them working alongside their father, learning to navigate temporal distortions while maintaining the barriers that kept reality stable. The brothers in these reflections aged slowly, their faces marked by wisdom and the weight of enormous responsibility. But their eyes held the satisfaction of meaningful purpose. Other reflections showed them rejecting the guardian's path, hiking back down the mountain toward their normal lives. But these timelines carried darker implications. The brothers returned to civilization, only to watch helplessly as temporal disturbances spread beyond the mountain's boundaries. Cities experienced time slips that trapped thousands of people in temporal loops. Historical events began occurring simultaneously with contemporary ones, creating paradoxes that tore at the fabric of reality itself. "Look closer," Thomas urged, pointing to one particularly disturbing set of reflections. "See what happens if the Shadow Guardians succeed." Marcus joined David before the mirror, and together they observed timelines where the convergence points were allowed to collapse completely. In these futures, the boundaries between past, present, and future dissolved entirely. They watched their mother aging and dying repeatedly as different timelines overlapped, saw their childhood home existing simultaneously in multiple decades, witnessed a world where cause and effect lost all meaning because every action occurred at the same time as its consequences. "This is what we're really protecting," David realized, the ring's warmth spreading up his arm as his understanding deepened. Not just time itself, but the linear progression that makes life meaningful. Without sequence, without the flow from past to future, existence becomes chaos. The mirror shifted again, showing them the Shadow Guardian's ultimate goal. In these timelines, reality had been restructured into a fluid state where past and future could be manipulated at will by those with sufficient knowledge and power. The Shadow Guardians ruled over populations trapped in temporal prisons, able to edit history to serve their desires, while the rest of humanity struggled to maintain coherent identities across constantly shifting timelines. "But there's another option," Marcus observed, pointing to a set of reflections that showed a different outcome entirely. In these timelines, the brothers accepted their guardian roles, but found a way to gradually heal the temporal damage that had accumulated over decades. Instead of simply maintaining unstable barriers, they worked to restore the mountain's natural state, eventually allowing them to return to normal lives while leaving the convergence point genuinely protected. "That's the path I've been working toward," Thomas admitted. "It requires a perfect understanding of temporal mechanics and extraordinary coordination between multiple guardian families worldwide. But if we succeed, this could be the last generation that has to sacrifice their normal lives for this responsibility." David was studying the healing timelines more closely, noting the complexity of the process involved. It would take decades of work, wouldn't it? And perfect coordination with guardians at other convergence points around the world. Yes, but with modern communication technology, that coordination is finally possible, Thomas explained. Previous generations had to work in isolation, maintaining barriers without being able to coordinate global efforts. We're the first generation with the tools to actually solve the problem, instead of just managing it. The mirror showed them the cost of each choice with brutal clarity. Accepting guardianship meant abandoning their mother, their careers, their normal relationships, but it offered the possibility of eventually healing reality itself. Rejecting the responsibility meant returning to comfortable lives while watching the world slowly dissolve into temporal chaos. Marcus stepped back from the mirror, overwhelmed by the scope of consequences their decision would create. How do you choose between saving reality and destroying your family? You realize, Thomas said quietly, that sometimes the greatest act of love is accepting a burden others can't understand. The mirror's surface rippled once more, showing them one final set of reflections, timelines where their mother eventually learned the truth about their choice and found peace in understanding the magnitude of what they were protecting. These futures showed her visiting the mountain in her old age, proud of sons who had chosen duty over comfort, sacrifice over selfishness. Outside the cavern, the temporal disturbances were growing stronger, and the ring on David's finger pulsed with increasing urgency. Time was running out for their decision. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with increasing intensity, and Thomas's instruments screamed warnings as temporal pressure reached levels that threatened the stability of the entire mountain. But instead of the chaos David expected to see through the ring's enhanced perception, he witnessed something that made him question everything they had been told. The storm that had driven them to the cabin, the perfectly timed weather that had forced their shelter-seeking, the sequential discoveries that had led them step by step to this moment, none of it had been coincidence. Through the ring's clarity, David could see the temporal manipulation threads that connected each event, all leading back to a device hidden deep within Thomas's mountain home. "Dad," David said slowly, "show us the weather control system." Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to resignation, the look of a man whose carefully maintained deception had finally been discovered. Without argument, he led them to a chamber they hadn't seen before, one that required multiple biometric locks to access and contained technology that belonged in no single time period. The device occupying the chamber's center was a masterwork of temporal engineering, combining components from past, present, and future into a machine that could manipulate atmospheric conditions across multiple timelines simultaneously. Weather patterns from different eras could be summoned, controlled, and directed with precision that made modern meteorology look primitive by comparison. "How long have you been controlling the weather?" Marcus demanded, his engineer's mind reeling at the sophistication of the technology before him. "Since the day after I arrived 20 years ago," Thomas admitted. The mountain's guardians had been using primitive weather control for generations, but I improved the system, made it precise enough to guide specific people to specific places at specific times. David felt betrayal rising in his chest, like a physical pain. "The storm that brought us here, you created it. You manipulated us into coming to the cabin, into finding the radio, into making this choice. I guided you toward a choice you were always going to have to make," Thomas corrected, adjusting controls on the weather device with practiced ease. "The temporal convergence is real. The threat from the Shadow Guardians is real, and your bloodline connection to this place is real. I simply ensured you would discover the truth under controlled conditions, rather than during a crisis." Marcus was studying the device's readouts, understanding gradually dawning. "This storm system, it's not just affecting our location. You've been manipulating weather patterns across multiple convergence points worldwide, coordinating with other Guardian families," Thomas confirmed. The next generation of Guardians needed to be brought together simultaneously, trained together, prepared to work as a unified force. "The Shadow Guardians have been planning this assault for decades. We had to be equally prepared." Through the ring's enhanced perception, David could see the global scope of his father's manipulation. Storms, droughts, unusual weather patterns that had been attributed to climate change. Many were actually the result of coordinated Guardian activities. designed to bring specific bloodlines to specific convergence points at precisely the right moments. "You've been playing puppet master with people's lives," David accused. "How many families have you manipulated? How many people have died in the storms you created?" Thomas's face showed the weight of 20 years of moral compromise. 17 guardian families needed to be activated simultaneously. The weather patterns I created displaced thousands of people, yes, but the alternative was the complete collapse of temporal reality. I made choices that cost some lives to save all lives. The device showed a global map with convergence points marked in pulsing light. At each location, weather anomalies were bringing new guardians into contact with their ancestral responsibilities. Hurricanes, blizzards, heat waves, all precisely calibrated to create the conditions necessary for the next generation of temporal protectors to accept their roles. But that's not the worst part, David realized. The ring showing him deeper layers of manipulation. "You've been controlling our entire lives, haven't you? Our career choices, our relationships, the paths that brought us to hiking these mountains." Thomas nodded slowly. "Eleanor thinks she chose to raise you with books about exploration and adventure. She thinks Marcus naturally gravitated toward engineering and David toward photography. But I've been influencing those choices through subtle temporal adjustments for 20 years. Preparing you for this moment, Marcus sat heavily on a stone bench, overwhelmed by the scope of his father's manipulation. Our mother, does she know any of this?" "She knows enough," Thomas said quietly. "She's always known I wasn't really dead, known that someday you would join me. Why do you think she never remarried? Why she kept my coffee cup, set my place at Christmas dinner? She's been preparing herself for the day when her sons would make the same choice their father did." The weather control device registered a new storm system forming, one not of Thomas's creation. Through the machine's sensors, they could detect the Shadow Guardian's own weather manipulation, creating atmospheric conditions that would allow them to move more freely between time streams. "They're coming," Thomas announced, his hands moving across the controls with desperate efficiency. "Everything I've done, all the manipulation and preparation, comes down to the next few hours. Either we hold the barriers together, or reality itself falls apart." David looked at his brother, seeing his own sense of betrayal reflected in Marcus's expression. They had been guided, manipulated, and prepared for this moment their entire lives. But the choice they faced remained genuine. Even if the path to it had been artificially constructed, the consequences were absolutely real. "The storms end when we make our decision," David realized, "one way or another." As the brothers struggled to process the scope of their father's manipulation, Thomas moved to a wall covered by what appeared to be a simple canvas tarp. With deliberate ceremony, he pulled the covering away to reveal something that transformed their understanding of the entire situation, from a local phenomenon to a cosmic crisis. The wall beneath displayed an ancient star map, but not of any constellation visible from Earth. The chart showed stellar formations from multiple galaxies, connected by lines of force that pulsed with the same energy signatures they had observed in the temporal disturbances. Most striking were the marked intersection points where these cosmic forces converged, dozens of locations scattered across what appeared to be multiple dimensional planes. "The convergence points aren't random locations on Earth," Thomas explained, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that had taken him years to understand. "They're where our reality intersects with fundamental forces that govern the structure of existence itself. What we call time is just how human consciousness perceives the intersection of multiple dimensional frequencies." David approached the star map, the family ring resonating so strongly with the depicted energy patterns that his entire arm began to pulse with sympathetic vibrations. Through the ring's enhanced perception, he could see that the marked convergence points formed a pattern, a vast geometric structure that spanned not just Earth, but multiple worlds across different galactic systems, every 70 Earth years, Thomas continued, tracing the energy lines with his finger. These dimensional frequencies align in a pattern that creates instability at all convergence points simultaneously. What we're experiencing here is happening on dozens of worlds, in hundreds of realities, all at the same moment across the cosmic timeline. Marcus studied the mathematical notations surrounding the star map, recognizing principles that extended far beyond terrestrial physics. You're describing a multidimensional engineering project. Someone or something designed this system deliberately. The architects, Thomas confirmed. We don't know who they were or when they existed, but they created a network of stabilization points across multiple realities. Each convergence point requires conscious maintenance by beings capable of existing partially outside linear time. On Earth, that means guardian, families with specific genetic markers that allow temporal perception. The star map showed other worlds with their own guardian networks, beings that might not be human but serve the same essential function. Some appeared to be energy creatures existing in gaseous environments. Others were depicted as collective consciousnesses that spanned entire planetary systems. All were connected by the same temporal stabilization network. The Shadow Guardians know about the architects, David realized, understanding flooding through him as the ring showed him deeper layers of the cosmic structure. They're not just trying to destabilize Earth's convergence points. They want to bring down the entire multidimensional network, Thomas nodded grimly. If enough convergence points fail simultaneously, the cascade effect would collapse the barriers between all realities. Every possible timeline, every potential universe, would exist in the same space at the same time. The result would be cosmic chaos that would destroy not just our universe, but every universe that has ever existed or could ever exist. The implications were staggering. David could see through the ring that the Shadow Guardians' assault wasn't limited to their mountain. Across the globe, other Guardian families were facing similar crises as convergence points came under coordinated attack. But more disturbing was the realization that similar battles were being fought on other worlds, in other dimensions, all linked by the architect's ancient network. Why us? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Why human beings? Why Earth? Because we're one of the few species that can perceive linear time while also being capable of existing outside it, Thomas explained. Most intelligent beings either experience time as a fluid, manipulable force, or they're completely trapped within linear progression. Humans occupy a unique middle ground that makes us ideal temporal stabilization agents. The star map pulsed with increasing intensity, responding to the cosmic alignment that was approaching its peak. David could see that their decision here would influence guardian choices on other worlds, creating either a cascade of successful defenses or a domino effect of failures. The other Guardian families, David said, studying the Earth-based convergence points marked on the map. They're all making the same choice we are right now. 17 families, 17 convergence points, all reaching critical decision moments within hours of each other, Thomas confirmed. The architects designed the system so that Guardian transitions would be synchronized across the entire planet. Unity of purpose across all convergence points or coordinated failure. Marcus was calculating the astronomical odds. The probability of 17 independent family groups all choosing to accept Guardian responsibilities simultaneously is virtually zero, Thomas finished. Which is why I spent 20 years manipulating circumstances to maximize the chances of success, not just for our family, but coordinating with Guardians worldwide to ensure optimal conditions for every crucial decision. The star map showed them something else, the consequences of success. If all 17 Guardian families accepted their responsibilities and coordinated their efforts, the multidimensional stabilization network could be upgraded rather than simply maintained. The cosmic crisis could become an opportunity to strengthen the barriers between realities permanently. We're not just choosing whether to become guardians, David realized. We're choosing whether to help evolve the entire cosmic system into something more stable and secure. Outside, the Shadow Guardians' assault was intensifying, but now the brothers understood they were part of a battle that spanned galaxies and determined the fate of existence itself. Thomas led them deeper into the mountain's core, through passages that had been carved not by human hands, but by the temporal forces themselves. The walls here showed the crystalline formations that marked areas where time moved at different rates, creating natural channels that guided temporal energy toward the convergence chamber. At the heart of the mountain lay a vast cavern dominated by equipment that defied easy categorization. The temporal stabilization array combined technology from multiple eras and possibly multiple worlds, all integrated into a system that pulsed with the rhythm of cosmic forces. Banks of crystalline processors interfaced with mechanical devices that looked like they belonged in a steampunk fantasy, while holographic displays showed data streams that tracked temporal fluctuations across 17 global convergence points. "This is what the Guardians have been building for 8 generations, Thomas explained, his hands moving across control surfaces that responded to thought as much as touch. Each Guardian family contributes knowledge and technology from their specific time period. The result is a stabilization system that exists partially outside normal time, allowing it to influence temporal flow across multiple dimensional frequencies." David approached the central control nexus, the family ring resonating so powerfully with the equipment that his entire body began to vibrate in harmony with cosmic forces. Through the ring's enhanced perception, he could see that the stabilization array wasn't just monitoring temporal disturbances, it was actively participating in the structure of reality itself. This requires 2 operators, Marcus realized, studying the control interfaces. The mathematical complexity alone would overwhelm a single consciousness, even one enhanced by temporal perception. "The architects designed it that way deliberately," Thomas confirmed. "Guardian families produce 2 children in each generation because the stabilization process requires paired consciousness, one to navigate the temporal currents, one to anchor the stabilization field to baseline reality." The equipment showed them the current status of all 17 convergence points worldwide. Most were under active assault by Shadow Guardians, with temporal barriers fluctuating wildly as dedicated families fought to maintain stability. But some points had already fallen, their Guardian families overwhelmed or corrupted, allowing Shadow Guardians to begin the process of dimensional collapse. "We're running out of time," David observed, watching as convergence point after convergence point shifted from green to amber to red on the global status display. "How many points need to fall before the cascade becomes irreversible?" 7, Thomas answered grimly. 6 points have already been compromised. If one more falls, the destabilization spreads to all remaining points automatically. The Shadow Guardians understand the system's vulnerabilities. Marcus was analyzing the technical specifications of the stabilization equipment, his engineering background allowing him to understand the principles even if the technology itself seemed impossible. This doesn't just maintain the barriers, it can actively repair temporal damage. But the energy requirements would be enormous. That's where the cosmic alignment comes in, Thomas explained, adjusting controls that showed power levels building toward critical thresholds. Every 70 years, the dimensional frequencies align in a pattern that provides enough energy to upgrade the entire multidimensional network. But that same energy, if misdirected, could destroy it completely. The equipment began responding to David's presence more actively, control surfaces lighting up as the family ring interfaced with systems that had been waiting decades for the right genetic signature. Holographic displays showed him potential futures, branching from the choices they would make in the next few hours. Timelines where reality stabilized into new configurations, and darker paths where existence itself came unraveled. The Shadow Guardians aren't trying to destroy reality out of malice. David understood suddenly. They believe the current system is flawed, that controlled collapse and reconstruction would create something better. They're willing to risk the annihilation of every conscious being in every possible universe, Thomas replied, for the chance to remake existence according to their design. Even if they succeed, trillions of lives would be lost in the transition. Marcus was studying the stabilization protocols, understanding the magnitude of what they were being asked to undertake. This isn't a temporary commitment. Once we activate these systems, we become part of them permanently. The equipment needs conscious guidance to function, and that guidance has to be continuous. For how long? David asked, though the family ring was already showing him the answer. Until the next cosmic alignment, Thomas said quietly. 70 years minimum. Possibly longer if the network upgrade requires additional stabilization time. The brothers looked at each other, seeing their own fears and determination reflected in familiar faces. They had been prepared for this moment their entire lives. But the reality of permanent exile from normal existence was harder to accept than any amount of training could have made it. There's something else, Thomas added, his voice heavy with knowledge he had hoped never to share. The stabilization process changes you. Permanent exposure to temporal forces alters human consciousness. After 70 years of Guardian service, you won't be the same people you are now. You'll be something between human and cosmic force, capable of existing across multiple timelines, but no longer truly belonging to any single reality. Outside the chamber, alarms began sounding as the Shadow Guardian's assault reached critical intensity. The decision could wait no longer. The alarms grew louder as Thomas activated what appeared to be the most sophisticated monitoring system the brothers had ever encountered. The dimensional breach monitor occupied an entire wall of the convergence chamber, its array of sensors and displays tracking ruptures in reality across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Unlike the earlier instruments they had seen, this device showed not just temporal disturbances, but actual tears in the fabric of existence itself. They're not just destabilizing the convergence points, Thomas announced, his voice tight with controlled panic as he studied the monitor's readouts. The Shadow Guardians are actively tearing holes between dimensions. They're forcing the convergence instead of waiting for the natural cosmic alignment. David watched in horrified fascination as the monitor displayed dimensional breaches opening like wounds across the mountain landscape. Through these tears, other realities bled through, versions of their world where different choices had led to different outcomes, parallel timelines where the Shadow Guardians had already succeeded, and darker possibilities where consciousness itself had been restructured into unrecognizable forms. The family ring burned against his finger as these alternate realities pressed against their own, each one trying to assert dominance over the others. Through the ring's enhanced perception, he could see Shadow Guardians moving through the dimensional breaches with equipment that belonged to no single timeline, weapons and tools that had been gathered from across multiple realities. The breach monitor shows 17 major ruptures opening simultaneously, Marcus observed, his engineering mind trying to process readings that defied known physics. But they're not random. There's a geometric pattern to their placement. Thomas was working frantically at the stabilization controls, trying to counteract the dimensional incursions. They're creating a resonance cascade. Each breach amplifies the others, weakening the barriers between all realities simultaneously. If we can't close them within the next hour, the damage becomes irreversible. The monitor revealed the scope of the Shadow Guardian's plan with terrifying clarity. They had spent decades infiltrating Guardian families worldwide, corrupting some, eliminating others, and positioning themselves to coordinate this massive assault on reality itself. The dimensional breaches weren't just random destruction. They were the first phase of a complete reconstruction of existence, according to Shadow Guardian design. Look at this. David called attention to a section of the monitor that showed temporal energy flows. They're not just trying to collapse the current system. They're redirecting the cosmic alignment energy into these breaches, using it to power something massive through the dimensional tiers. They could see Shadow Guardian installations on other worlds. Similar operations being conducted by corrupted Guardians across multiple galactic systems. The assault was coordinated not just across Earth's convergence points, but across the entire multidimensional network the architects had created. The ultimate goal, Thomas realized with growing horror, isn't destruction, it's transformation. They want to merge all possible realities into a single manipulable dimension where cause and effect can be edited at will. Marcus was studying the technical specifications displayed by the breach monitor. The energy requirements for that kind of reality restructuring would be enormous. They'd need to channel the power from multiple cosmic alignments simultaneously, which is exactly what they're doing, David said, the family ring showing him deeper layers of the Shadow Guardian's plan. The 70-year cycle isn't random. It corresponds to multi-dimensional alignments that occur across different galactic systems at staggered intervals. They've been waiting for the moment when all those alignments overlap. The monitor's alarms reached critical intensity as the dimensional breaches began to stabilize and expand. Through the tiers in reality, Shadow Guardians were beginning to move equipment and personnel from multiple timelines, consolidating resources from past and future into a single devastating assault on the present moment. They have Guardians from timelines where they already won, Thomas announced, his voice filled with the weight of terrible understanding. They're using successful Shadow Guardian operations from other realities to reinforce their assault on ours. David could see through the ring that their mountain had become the focal point of the multidimensional assault. The stone circle below was beginning to glow with energies that had nothing to do with natural temporal forces. It was being transformed into an anchor point for reality, restructuring on a cosmic scale. The convergence points, Marcus asked urgently. How many are still holding? Thomas checked the global status display, his expression darkening further. 12 points compromised, 4 more under active assault. Only 1 point remains fully stable, and it's not enough to maintain the network if we fall. The dimensional breach monitor showed new tiers opening directly around their location, bringing Shadow Guardians armed with temporal weapons into their immediate vicinity. The final assault was beginning, and the brothers had mere minutes to decide whether to attempt the desperate gamble of activating the stabilization system or watch reality itself be torn apart and remade. The equipment is charged and ready, Thomas announced. But remember, once you begin the stabilization process, there's no going back. You'll be committed to 70 years of service, and the cosmic forces will change you in ways we can't predict. Through the dimensional breaches, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from multiple timelines simultaneously, as Shadow Guardians from past and future converged on their location for the final confrontation. As Shadow Guardians poured through the dimensional breaches surrounding their location, Thomas led the brothers to the stabilization system's core, a crystalline structure that pulsed with energies drawn from the cosmic alignment itself. At its heart lay an artifact that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, the Master Temporal Key. The key defied easy description, appearing as a complex geometric form that shifted and changed depending on the angle of observation. Sometimes it looked like a crystalline matrix, other times like flowing energy, and occasionally like mathematical equations made manifest in physical space. But its purpose was unmistakably clear. This was the device that could either stabilize all realities or destroy them completely. The architects created only one master key for each galactic cluster. Thomas explained as temporal weapons fire began echoing through the mountain passages around them. It requires two consciousness to operate, one to guide the stabilization energy, one to anchor the process to baseline reality. But the cost? David reached toward the key, the family ring resonating so powerfully that his entire arm became translucent, showing the temporal energies flowing through his enhanced nervous system. The operator guides the energy but becomes permanently connected to the multi-dimensional network. The anchor maintains contact with normal reality, but sacrifices the ability to exist fully in any single timeline. Marcus understood the implications immediately. One of us becomes essentially immortal, but isolated from normal existence. The other maintains human connection, but lives partially outside time forever. Through the dimensional breaches, Shadow Guardians were advancing with weapons that fired temporal distortions, seeking to disrupt the stabilization process before it could begin. Thomas was operating defensive systems that had been built into the mountain over decades, but the assault was overwhelming their protective capabilities. "Choose quickly," Thomas urged, his hands moving across controls that were already beginning to fail under the Shadow Guardians' assault. The cosmic alignment reaches peak intensity in less than 10 minutes. After that, the energy required for stabilization won't be available for another 70 years. David and Marcus looked at each other, a lifetime of shared understanding passing between them in a single glance. They had always been complementary halves of a greater whole, David's intuitive leaps balanced by Marcus's analytical precision, Marcus's caution tempered by David's willingness to take necessary risks. "I'll guide," David said, placing his hands on the sections of the master key that pulsed with creative energy. "You anchor." "No," Marcus replied firmly, moving to the key's stabilization matrix. "You're the artist, the visionary. You can see possibilities I never could. Guide the process. I'll maintain our connection to reality." Before David could argue, the mountain shook as Shadow Guardians breached the final defensive barriers. Through the dimensional tiers, corrupted guardians from failed timelines began flooding into the convergence chamber, bringing with them the chaos of realities where the stabilization network had already collapsed. David placed his consciousness into full interface with the master key, feeling his awareness expand across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through the cosmic alignment's energy, he could perceive every convergence point across the galactic network, see the Shadow Guardians' assault on reality itself, and understand the staggering complexity of the stabilization process he was attempting to guide. Marcus anchored himself to the key's reality matrix, feeling his connection to normal time stretch and strain as he became the fixed point around which David's multidimensional work could stabilize. The process was excruciating, maintaining human consciousness while experiencing the flow of cosmic forces that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. Around them, the battle raged as Thomas and the mountain's automated defenses fought desperately to protect the stabilization process. Shadow Guardians wielded weapons that deleted sections of time, created temporal loops that trapped their enemies in recursive moments, and fired energy bursts that aged targets to death in seconds. But David was working on a scale that transcended the immediate conflict. Through the master key, he reached across dimensional barriers to coordinate with Guardian families on other worlds, synchronizing stabilization efforts across multiple galactic systems. The cosmic alignment provided enough energy to upgrade the entire multi-dimensional network, but only if every remaining Guardian family coordinated their efforts perfectly. Marcus felt his brother's consciousness expanding beyond human limits as David became something more than mortal, a guiding intelligence capable of perceiving and directing temporal forces across infinite realities. But Marcus maintained their anchor to humanity, ensuring that the vast cosmic processes David was orchestrating remained connected to the small, Precious reality where their mother waited for news of her sons. The master key reached critical activation as the cosmic alignment peaked, sending stabilization energy cascading across every convergence point in the galactic network. Shadow Guardian weapons began malfunctioning as the temporal distortions they relied upon were systematically corrected, and the dimensional breaches started closing as reality reasserted its proper structure. But the victory came at the cost both brothers had understood from the beginning. David's consciousness now existed primarily in the multi-dimensional realm, connected to cosmic forces, but forever changed beyond normal human experience. Marcus remained anchored to baseline reality, but could feel time flowing around him in ways that separated him from the normal progression of mortal existence. They had saved every possible reality, but they were no longer entirely part of any single one. 6 months had passed since the convergence, though time itself had become a fluid concept for the brothers, who now existed partially outside its normal flow. The mountain had settled into a new rhythm, its temporal energies stabilized but fundamentally transformed. By the cosmic upgrade they had helped orchestrate across the multidimensional network, Marcus stood at the observation platform his father had built, watching the morning light paint the valley below in shades of gold that seemed richer somehow, as if reality itself had been enhanced by their success. In his hands, he held an artifact that had appeared 3 days ago in the stone circle, a compass unlike any in their families. History, this new compass was smaller than the brass instrument that had guided them to their destiny, crafted from materials that seemed to shift between metal and crystal, depending on how the light caught them. Its needle pointed not toward temporal disturbances or convergence points, but toward something else entirely: hope, purpose, the possibility of futures where guardian duty might be shared rather than shouldered by isolated families. "It's beautiful." David's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, his consciousness now distributed across multiple dimensional frequencies, but still capable of communicating with his brother. "The architects left it for us, didn't they?" Marcus nodded, understanding flowing through their enhanced connection. "A compass for the next generation. But this one points toward balance, ways to protect reality without requiring complete sacrifice from guardian families." Through the multidimensional network they now helped maintain, both brothers could perceive the global changes their success had created. The 17 convergence points that had survived the Shadow Guardian assault were all operating with unprecedented stability. More importantly, the cosmic upgrade had created new possibilities for sharing guardian responsibilities across larger communities rather than concentrating them in individual families. Thomas had adapted to his son's transformation with the resilience of someone who had spent 20 years preparing for the impossible. He had become their liaison to normal reality, helping them maintain connections to the human world they were still fundamentally committed to protecting. "The other guardian families are reporting similar artifacts," Thomas announced, climbing up to the platform with the careful movements of someone whose body was finally showing the accumulated effects of decades in temporal fields. Compasses, crystals, instruments that point toward collaborative solutions rather than solitary duty. Marcus studied the new compass more closely, noting how its design incorporated elements from all the artifacts they had encountered during their journey to understanding. The family crest was there, but modified to include symbols representing cooperation across bloodlines. The temporal sensitivity remained, but enhanced to detect opportunities for shared responsibility rather than individual burden. "The network is evolving," David observed, his enhanced perception allowing him to see patterns emerging across the cosmic stabilization system. The upgrade didn't just strengthen the barriers between realities, it created new possibilities for how guardian duties can be structured. Through their connection to the multidimensional network, They could observe other worlds where guardian responsibilities had been successfully distributed among larger communities. Instead of isolated families bearing impossible burdens across generations, entire societies had learned to share the work of maintaining reality's stability. We could train others, Marcus realized. The new compass showing him pathways toward that future. Not to replace us, but to help us. People who could handle smaller responsibilities while we maintain the major systems. The compass pulsed with approval, its needle swinging toward coordinates that indicated several locations where potential candidates were already showing signs of temporal sensitivity. Unlike their family's hereditary connection, these new guardians would be chosen by aptitude and dedication rather than bloodline. Thomas was documenting everything, creating records that future generations could use to build upon their achievements. "Your mother deserves to know what you've accomplished," he said quietly. "She spent 6 months believing you're dead." Marcus and David had discussed this possibility extensively. Through the new compass, they could see a future where Eleanor Thornfield learned the truth about her family's cosmic responsibilities and found peace in understanding the magnitude of what her sons were protecting. "Bring her here," David suggested, his multidimensional awareness showing him the safest pathways for such a reunion. "The mountain is stable enough now to allow visitors. She could see what we've become, understand why we chose this path." The new compass showed Marcus something even more hopeful, timelines where their mother eventually became part of the Guardian community herself, using her librarian skills to help document and preserve the knowledge that future Guardians would need. "And after that?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to understand the possibilities the new compass represented. Marcus smiled, feeling more optimistic about their situation than he had since accepting the Guardian role. "After that, we start building something better. A system where protecting reality doesn't require abandoning the people we love." The compass pointed steadily toward a future where duty and family could coexist, where cosmic responsibility could be shared among communities united by purpose rather than genetics, and where the next generation of Guardians might inherit hope instead of sacrifice below them. The stone circle pulsed with gentle energy, no longer a barrier between worlds, but a bridge toward better possibilities.